but the negligent diplomat eventually rose to become Japan's deputy foreign minister. Bruce Dunning, CBS News, Tokyo.
Insurance company Conseco has broken off its plans for a corporate marriage with Kemper. The two had been engaged since June when Conseco bid $67 a share for Kemper. It lowered that 3 weeks ago to $60. Kemper says it's still on the market. World markets seem to have those wedding bell blues this morning. Share prices in London were lower in early trading. Prices in Tokyo fell again, partly due to another 5% drop in Sony stock. The Nikkei index lost 180 points to land at its lowest level since March 31st. The dollar wrapped up trading in Tokyo at 98.66 yen. Gold opened in London at $383.70 an ounce. None of this bodes well for Wall Street, where the Dow Industrials opened today at 38.15 after losing 12 3/4 on Friday. The NASDAQ Composite opens at 764 2/3. It slipped 1.17 Friday. Former Senator Warren Rudman will head a panel reviewing the operations of the NASDAQ and its governing body. The National Association of Securities Dealers named the 7-person committee yesterday, but says the review will not touch on charges of price fixing and other anti-competitive behavior under investigation by the Justice Department. OPEC nations are talking about freezing output for a year. Oil ministers meeting in Indonesia heard Saudi Arabia's representative tell other cartel members a freeze would help weaker oil markets. The mere threat is already doing one other thing OPEC wants, pushing oil prices higher on world markets this morning.
Now let's take a look at this morning's scoreboard. Now on CBS News, up to the minute, the president faces a reality check while the Republicans deal with a crack in unity.
And the fighting in Bosnia heats up amid reports NATO may strike. Good morning from CBS News in New York. This is Up to the Minute. I'm Cheryl Atkinson.
And I'm Troy Roberts. Thanks for joining us this morning. Here's what's happening. After returning from a 10-day trip to the Far East and Hawaii, President Clinton must now face his own political reality today. Solid Republican majorities in both houses of the new Congress have been busy at work. But as Bob Orr reports, the Republicans' United Front may be showing some cracks.
President and Mrs. Clinton returned to a Capitol that's been moved to the right by Republican plans for an aggressive conservative agenda.
I think we've been given an opportunity here to do something about the tremendous national debt that we have and the deficit that we face every year, and to get government under control.
But there is an early crack in the new Republican congressional solidarity. Speaker-to-be Newt Gingrich has surprised colleagues by pledging a quick vote on a constitutional amendment for prayer in public schools.
I think Newt Gingrich should dance with the gal that brung him, and the gal that brung him was the tax and spend issue and crime and welfare.
Our Father, who art in heaven.
School prayer was outlawed 30 years ago by the Supreme Court. Now Gingrich has pushed it onto a crowded agenda, which could cause problems for Republicans who campaigned on tax and spending cuts. Some fear spending political capital on school prayer risks repeating President Clinton's early move to tackle the explosive issue of gays in the military.
If we're going to bring about change, we better bring up some measures we can pass so the American people will get the message that we're serious about it.
The warning to Gingrich from his Republican colleagues could not be more clear. Among the many goals of this new Republican Congress, school prayer should not be at the top of the list. Bob Orr, CBS News, Washington.
Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin is expected to discuss escalating tensions in Gaza when he meets with President Clinton this morning. The Prime Minister arrived in the U.S. last night. He's expected to bring up the Palestinian unrest in the Gaza Strip. And Rabin says he'll press the U.S. to make good on its pledges of aid for Palestinians in Gaza. Later this week, Rabin meets with Yasser Arafat to discuss the PLO chairman's charges that Israel had a role in a deadly riot in Gaza on Friday. The PLO and its fundamentalist opponent Hamas have reportedly agreed to a ceasefire. Israeli radio reports the accord will be announced later today or tomorrow. It quotes a mediator as saying PLO leader Yasser Arafat has agreed to a Hamas demand to establish a commission to determine responsibility for Friday's clash. The report also says the PLO has agreed to free all 300 people detained during Friday's rioting.
The fighting in Bosnia this morning is heating up and could escalate to another level. The New York Times reports that only bad weather stopped a NATO airstrike yesterday against a Serb-controlled airfield in Croatia. The Times quotes unidentified Western officials as saying NATO warplanes were ready to bomb the airfield from which Serb planes have launched bombing runs into northwestern Bosnia. But earlier yesterday, the NATO Secretary General said if there was an airstrike, it would come without warning.
Not ready to warn the Serbs what we are prepared to hit. You will see this afterwards.
The Croatian Serb leadership is reportedly warning that a NATO airstrike would be an attack and they would respond. Renewed fighting broke out in Sarajevo this morning. A guided missile hit the city hall. Witnesses say at least one person was injured and streets buckled. Heavy fighting also continues in the Bihać area of Bosnia. The Bosnian Serb army says it was closing in on Bihać, which is a designated UN safe zone. And just north of Bihać, Muslim rebels have joined forces with the Serbs and are battling government troops. Near Zenica in central Bosnia, government forces are taking up positions recently abandoned by the Serbs in an effort to shore up their positions in that area.
In Canada, officials say vandals may have been responsible for causing the crash of a train heading from Toronto to Montreal last night. The train was carrying more than 400 people when it hit something on the tracks. Simon Dingley of CBC Television reports.
Ontario Provincial Police say last night's Via Rail train accident may have been no accident. Train 66 en route from Toronto to Montreal, carrying more than 400 passengers and crew, caught fire near Brighton, Ontario, 125 kilometers east of Toronto. Amazingly, the train kept going as the fire spread from the engine to the passenger cars, and people jumped out for their lives.
We were in the second car, and there were planes that were, as the train was hitting down the tracks, planes were shooting out until it finally came to a stop, and then smoke came billowing in. We had to smash out the windows. My wife and my two children, we passed the children out, we came out.
Authorities have recovered a 1 meter long metal rail track, which they believe punctured the train's fuel tank. Police investigated through the night and think it may be sabotage.
Is this a suspicious incident to the authorities?
Yes, it is.
Many passengers received medical attention at a local high school, but there were no serious injuries. This Quebec couple were taking their first train trip in Canada. They thought they were going to die. Eventually, most passengers boarded buses and arrived early this morning in Montreal. It's a trip none of them will ever forget. Simon Dingley, CBC News, Brighton, Ontario.
One man was killed and at least 8 of his crewmates were injured after a coal ship caught fire off the Massachusetts coast. The 900-foot Polydoros was bound for Italy when the fire broke out. Rescue crews used 2 helicopters to lift crew members from the ship. 4 of the ship's officers stayed on board to fight the blaze. Still no word on how the fire started. Singer David Crosby is in critical but stable condition this morning after undergoing a liver transplant. Crosby is recuperating at UCLA Medical Center, and his doctor says he's pleased with the way the surgery went. The 53-year-old Crosby is a member of the legendary folk rock band Crosby, Stills and Nash. His publicist says Crosby's liver deteriorated after years of drug abuse.
All-night talks between the Postal Service and 2 of its unions failed to deliver a new contract this morning. The talks now go into binding arbitration. Wages and benefits are the key issues between the service and the unions, representing nearly 600,000 employees. But you can expect your mail delivery as usual, since it is against the law for postal workers to go on strike. A famous frog arrived by special delivery in the Big Apple. The Holiday Express train brought Kermit the Frog, that famous webbed wonder, to the Museum of History yesterday to meet fans. The affable amphibian is in New York City to shed a little green on the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And that's Thursday. He's just killing time between now and then, sightseeing, autographs.
Yeah. Frog with plenty of time on his hands. Head on up to the minute. Life for Native Americans in the past and today.
An important exhibit opens in New York City detailing the lives of the American Indians. Stay with us.
A new National Museum of the American Indian is open in New York City. It explores how difficult life was before settlers moved in and how much more difficult it is today for Native Americans. CBS News correspondent Martha Teichner reports.
My name is Abe Conklin. My Indian name is Nikawasa, which means bear man. I'm with the Osage and Ponca tribe of Oklahoma.
In a church basement outside Chicago, Abe Conklin sheds the trappings of modern mainstream America and prepares for the dance of his ancestors.
I've always remembered what one of our old chiefs said. He said, "There's a flood coming." He said, "Be prepared. Learn to swim in this flood." So that's what we had to do.
The flood was the white man, and Abe Conklin was determined that Bear Man would not drown. With a foot on two paths, that's how Abe Conklin and other Native Americans have survived in the white man's world, but retained their own identity. All roads are good, something Abe was taught as a child, is the name of the first exhibit at the new National Museum of the American Indian in New York City. This is the first of what will eventually be 3 branches of the museum. The biggest is to open in the year 2001, next to the Capitol in Washington, D.C.
And each one of these rings that are on the bear hat represent one potlatch.
The fact that this collection exists at all and is now part of the Smithsonian Institution is one of the ironies that resulted from the exploitation of American Indians. For more than 50 years, George Gustav High, a wealthy New York banker, bought Indian artifacts, literally by the boxcar. Over 1 million of them. Most ended up in this warehouse.
Well, here is the pottery collection, or a good deal of it. And
to Richard West, director of the museum, Cheyenne himself, that was a mixed blessing. The objects were saved as tribal life disintegrated, but at a price.
This material, for the best of intentions in some cases, had been removed from the native communities who had made it in the first instance, and a part of whose lives it had been, and it was gone.
For American Indians, to reconnect with the past is to reconnect with the land. Out of the land comes life itself. In turn, life is invested in every object, every work of art. This spiritual relationship is at the heart of Indian culture.
I always pray. That's the way it was taught to me. We ask permission from our ancestors. I asked my grandmothers and my great-grandmothers to come and be with me and to help me have a good harvest.
It is long willow shoots that Pomo basket maker Susan Billy is cutting. In the hills of Northern California, this was a traditional gathering place long before a highway divided it. And before the day Susan and a friend found that road crews had been through.
And we came, and it was absolutely clear-cut back to those trees. And I just stood here and cried.
The willows are a metaphor for the difficulties Susan and other Indians have trying to preserve their heritage in a non-Indian world.
For one thing, I mean, this is totally destroyed for any kind of harvest now, although because
Susan Billy is torn. She's a single mother, and to make a living, she runs a bead shop in Ukiah, California.
I have semi-precious stone beads and glass, metal. Sometimes it takes years to make a basket. See, I can't abandon the other things I'm involved in. This is something that I really struggle with. When I look at a basket, I look at a number.
Susan was one of the 23 Native Americans asked to choose objects from the High collection for the new museum. Like all the other selectors, she was overwhelmed.
Once I began to handle objects, they got bigger in my hands, almost, you know? I mean, you could feel it. They became more alive as anything that you touch.
Susan Billy recovered her Indianness through art. The Mashantucket Pequots of Connecticut did it through money. On the verge of extinction a few years ago, gambling has allowed them to be reborn. Last month, they gave $10 million toward the new Indian Museum complex. It was the largest gift in Smithsonian history. How times have changed. Reduced to a cynical museum piece, the old Indian school where Native American culture was systematically obliterated. At the Santa Fe Indian School today, the opposite. Native life and language are taught alongside English.
That's their job. That's their responsibility.
Our elders are there to teach us when we do not know, to guide us when we are lost.
For Kim Cisneros and her generation, it is natural to live with a foot in both worlds.
But we have to be willing to learn from them.
But home is here, on Santa Clara Pueblo.
Oh, it's a wonderful place to grow up.
It is Rena Swensel's spiritual home. She, too, was one of the selectors for the Indian Museum. She no longer lives at Santa Clara, but comes back often.
We knew where we belonged. We had a real strong sense of place. And it wasn't just in terms of the people, it was also in terms of the mountains and the hills that we grew up in.
So strong is the need to reconnect with native culture and values that many Indians are coming back to the reservations. Marie Suazo quit her office job on the outside to make pottery full-time.
And you say you like the polishing best?
Yeah.
Why?
It shows that it's happy.
So the shine of the pot is the happiness.
Happiness.
The pot will sell for $1,200. The money means her art can be passed on to her children. But the idea of preserving Indian culture by selling it disturbs Rena Swensel.
Been able to survive as long as they have. I think the biggest thing is to remember those cloud skin, and to remember where the source of the wind is, where the source of our breath is, and that source. I think that source becomes less the more we watch television, the more we sell our pots.
The objects Rena and the other selectors chose for the museum are intended to serve as a touchstone for Native Americans. But in fact, they will be seen mainly by non-Indians. Museum Director Richard West.
What I think ultimately we're going to see is an export of some of those things which have defined us as Indians to those who can learn from native cultures themselves, who are not Indians, never will be.
And so it is that now, when Abe Conklin dances, certain non-Indians are allowed to dance with him because they are willing to learn Ponca tribal ways, and because, as Abe was taught a lifetime ago, all roads are good.
And back with more news right after a break.
This is CBS News Up to the Minute. Here's a look at your weather forecast this morning. Rain and snow forms over much of our map. Gordon is expected to hover over the Atlantic coast from the Carolinas to New Jersey. Snow flurries dot the mountains of Colorado and New Mexico. Late in the day, a storm brings rain and snow to Washington state. Our temperature map tells us much of Monday's weather will be around the eastern U.S. Will be mild, 50s and 60s over the mid-Atlantic, and warm 70s and 80s for the southeast. For the western U.S., expect cold, winterly teens in the northern Rockies and 20 and 30 degree highs for the Northwest.
A celebration marking the 600th anniversary of Seoul as the capital of South Korea was certainly a real blast. A wrecking crew packed over 1,000 pounds of explosives into a 17-story apartment complex, and news of the imminent explosion had thousands of Koreans vying for position to catch a glimpse, and those who couldn't get close only had to turn on the TV. It was broadcast live to the nation. Heck of a way to celebrate a city's anniversary. The apartment complex was gone in just minutes. City officials called the 22-year-old building an eyesore and had lobbied for years for its destruction. In up-to-the-minute sports, Steve Young threw a pair of scoring passes to Jerry Rice as the San Francisco 49ers built a 21-6 halftime lead over the Los Angeles Rams. Todd Kinchin helped the Rams give the 49ers more than just a scare in the second half. Kinchin weaved his way through the 49ers secondary on a 44-yard end around as the Rams closed to within 21-12. Then Chris Miller went 50 yards over the head of Deion Sanders to Flipper Anderson, and the Rams trailed 24-19. When Miller went 21 yards to Jesse Hester in the fourth quarter, the Rams took a 27-24 lead, and it stayed that way until a minute 56 remained. That's when Young hit Rice, who had fumbled the ball away minutes before, to give the 49ers a 31-27 win. The Rams dropped to 4-7. The 49ers kept pace with Dallas atop in the NFL at 9-2. The Cowboys beat Washington 31-7, but may have lost Troy Aikman for up to 4 weeks after he suffered a sprained left knee. Aikman left Texas Stadium before the game ended, and his replacement, Rodney Peete, sprained his right thumb. Third stringer Jason Garrett replaced Peete, leaving Barry Switzer with the prospect of starting his third stringer on Thursday against Green Bay. Now let's check the up-to-the-minute scoreboard. As the weekend began, the first court appearance for Susan Smith. Defense and prosecution lawyers probed and parried about her state of mind and about the defense Smith might mount against the charges that she killed her 2 children. CBS News correspondent Randall Pinkston reports.
A grim-faced Susan Smith entered the courtroom, glancing briefly at the spectators where her family, including her estranged husband David, were seated. The principal issue, the prosecution's motion to have Smith evaluated by state psychiatrists to determine whether she was insane the night she pushed her car into a lake with her 2 sons strapped in the back seat.
She stated at one point that she wanted to end her life so bad. She was a nervous wreck. She was an absolute mental case.
The prosecution admitted that it's unprecedented to file such a motion this early in the proceeding and called a state forensic psychiatrist to justify a speedy examination.
The closer to the incident, if the issue is criminal responsibility, the better it is and the more reliable our findings can be.
In the courtroom, Susan Smith displayed a grief she only feigned during her 9-day hoax when she claimed her sons were kidnapped. Her attorney strenuously objected to an immediate evaluation, fearing the state might use the results to determine if she should receive the death penalty.
Susan right now is a lot like a 6-year-old child. She cannot defend herself. She needs to be protected.
The judge held off on a ruling on that motion and on an effort by the prosecution to get Susan Smith's lawyer to indicate whether he might use an insanity defense. The judge says it might seem like a simplistic decision, but it's not. Indeed, nothing in this tragic case has been simple. Randall Pinkston, CBS News, York, South Carolina.
And that's our news for this half hour.
This is CBS News Up to the Minute.
Experience CBS News. Would you go as far as these people to make someone smile, to lend a helping hand, or to save a child's life? A special 48 Hours Wednesday.
A real-life whodunit and a blood expert's startling theory. Could he solve her murder 6 years later? Find out on Eye on America tonight on the CBS Evening News. This is CBS.
Now on CBS News, up to the minute, gunfire across Bosnia as NATO threatens retaliation.
And a fiery train crash in Canada. Are vandals to blame?
Good morning. This is CBS News Up to the Minute. I'm Troy Roberts.
And I'm Cheryl Atkinson. Here's what's happening this Monday morning. A Canadian rail official says vandals may be to blame. A train with more than 400 people aboard hit something on the tracks, puncturing the fuel tank and sparking a fire that injured as many as 60 passengers. Simon Dingley of the CBC has the latest.
There were 417 passengers and crew on Via Rail Train 66 en route from Toronto to Montreal. At about 6:30 Sunday evening, the train hit something in the tracks about 2 kilometers outside Brighton, Ontario. That's about 125 kilometers from Toronto. The fuel tank on the train ruptured. It caused a fire that went from the engine to the club cab and right into the passenger train. Apparently, the train kept going and some passengers leapt from the train's windows while it was moving. Reports say up to 60 people were injured, many of them suffering cuts and bruises and some broken bones, but no serious injuries. One passenger told us that it was like being in a wall of fire.
We felt that was the end. The flames all around the car and the smoke and the heat and all that, and we really felt it very bad.
The injured have been taken to hospitals in the area and as far away as Toronto, and other people who managed to survive have gone on to Montreal by bus. Simon Dingley, CBC News, Brighton, Ontario.
A fire on board a 900-foot coal ship bound for Italy has killed one man and injured at least 8 of his crewmates. They were raised one by one into helicopters and flown to Cape Cod. 4 men, the ship's officers, refused to leave the Polidoros, saying they were staying on board to fight the fire. There's no word on how the fire started, but authorities say it spread quickly. In North Carolina, at least 1 person is dead and another 5 injured after an explosion and fire at a furniture plant. The force of the blast was felt for miles around the town of Lenoir. The mayor says it blew out the sides of the boiler room at the Broyhill factory, and then flames spread into an area where particle board is made.
New violence in Bosnia this morning. A guided missile hit the Sarajevo City Hall. The UN blames Serb forces for similar attacks last Thursday and Friday. There are reports of 1 injury. NATO forces are said to be ready to launch airstrikes today against Serb targets threatening the northwest Bosnian area of Bihać. According to today's New York Times, only bad weather prevented an airstrike yesterday. CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi reports from Sarajevo.
As the Bosnian Serb advance in Bihać continues, the UN said the situation there has grown considerably worse. The Bosnian government claimed tanks from the Serb-controlled Krajina region of Croatia were operating in Bihać. Ham radio operators reported that the tanks were firing into Bihać from positions inside Krajina. Whatever the case, the pressure is building for NATO to act.
Well, the concrete action would be to take out those tanks. Serious airstrikes.
NATO has UN approval for airstrikes and says it will strike without warning, probably in reaction to further Serb provocation rather than as punishment for past actions.
I'm not ready to warn the Serbs what we are prepared to hit. You will see this afterwards.
The most likely target is the airfield from which Serb planes launched 2 raids. But in theory, any Serb air raid or an attack from the Serb-occupied Krajina region would be grounds for an airstrike. The Croatian Serb leadership denies involvement in the Bihać fighting and reportedly warned that a NATO strike would be considered an attack by Croatia, to which Krajina Serbs would respond, and that risks widening the war. UN forces here are on full alert, and there is growing concern at the fate of 1,200 peacekeepers trapped in the Bihać pocket. UN commanders say local civilians are beginning to turn on them in frustration at the lack of action by NATO and the UN. Alan Pizzi, CBS News, Sarajevo.
Just ahead of the heaviest travel weekend of the year, U.S. Air announced it has created the position of Vice President of Corporate Safety and named a retired commander of American Air Forces in Europe to do the job. 58-year-old Robert Oakes will oversee all flying and ground safety activities at U.S. Air beginning December 1st. The U.S. Postal Service and two of its unions have failed to reach agreement on a new contract, but you'll still get your mail today. Postal workers are prohibited by law from striking. The two sides will go to binding arbitration. Talks with a third union are continuing.
Across the country, come January, there will be 30 Republican governors, 11 more than now. They're meeting in Virginia this week and coming up with an agenda of their own. They started out by declaring that the message of this year's elections gives them a lot more clout, that the voters want less federal and more state government.
This conference is about federalism. It's about states. It's about the capacity of states to do just that. We're balancing budgets. We're reforming welfare. We're fixing health care. We're dealing with crime. Our message will be to congressional leaders and the people of this country, give us the ball and then get out of the way. We can solve these problems.
The governors may clash with their party's leadership on Capitol Hill. Incoming House Speaker Newt Gingrich is pushing for a vote on federal welfare reform in the first 100 days of the 104th Congress.
Both parties on Capitol Hill are trying to calm a storm started by the incoming chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Jesse Helms said Friday he does not think President Clinton is qualified to be commander-in-chief. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff expressed his full confidence in the president first thing Saturday, and yesterday a few more parties weighed in.
You know, I can see why Senator Helms may feel that way. He takes a very strong position in foreign policy and really does quite a good job. But I think we have to back whoever is president and do the very best we can to help him to do a good job, or her, when we have a woman president.
To have a senior member of the Senate of the United States undermine the president of the United States as commander-in-chief at a time in which it is delicate in the world, in North Korea, in Haiti, in the Middle East, I think is very, very reckless. And I regret deeply that he said it, and I would hope he'd apologize.
President Clinton ignored reporters' questions about the Helms' comment as he returned to the White House yesterday. He is focusing on a compromise with the new Republican Congress. At the top of his agenda will likely be a middle-class tax cut, welfare reform, and some form of scaled-down health care reform. As for whether there is any chance of getting any of this passed, CBS News correspondent Bill Plant has that.
We want to work with you in a bipartisan way, and let's maybe pick 3 or 4 things we can agree on. I will do everything in my power to reach out to the leaders and the members of this new Congress.
Mr. Clinton will paint himself as a responsible centrist. His budget will contain spending cuts to pay for the tax cuts which it proposes. He'll portray the Republican leadership as radical and dangerously irresponsible.
There's going to be plenty of tension, and some of the rhetoric is going to get unbelievably harsh before we're done.
But there's a real incentive for both sides to get something done, even as each tries to prevent the other from getting credit. The voters want action, and if they don't get it, both Congress and the president may pay a price.
Nothing happens if we're just kind of down in the dirt for the next 2 years. Then both sides will suffer, and the possibility of an independent force emerging to take advantage of them becomes that much greater.
But even with the stakes that high, getting the Democrats in the White House or the Republicans in Congress to compromise as the presidential political season begins may be more than is humanly possible. The two sides will make their first attempt to get the ball rolling with the meeting this week. Bill Plant, CBS News, New York.
The British are betting, and you'll never believe who's winning. 7 ticket holders who guessed the right 6 numbers will share the equivalent of a $9.3 million jackpot in Britain's first ever lottery. The numbers were drawn on national television Saturday night with nearly half of all Britons watching.
I think people will be encouraged by the fact that 7 people have won over £800,000 today, 1,100,000 people have won prizes altogether. You know, there are 39 people who have woken up this morning some £46,000 better off each. No, I think it's a tremendous result.
Now, according to the Today newspaper, one of those 1.1 million lesser winners is none other than Queen Elizabeth. One royal source told the newspaper the Queen, quote, gets very excited when something she bets on comes in even second or third. How much will Her Highness pocket? She won £10, but she'll have to split it with 20 other members of the royal family. Each will get 50 pence, or about 80 cents.
Just trying to get the image in my mind of the Queen filling out her number. We'll be back with more news after this. Islamic fundamentalists and the PLO blaming one another for Friday's deadly riots in the Gaza Strip. There is word this morning that both sides have reached an agreement. Israel Radio says it will be announced later today. Any announcement may not come in time to help PLO chief Yasser Arafat. Arafat's leadership is now shaky because of how some fundamentalists view his agreement with the Israelis for self-rule. Keith Graves of British Sky News reports.
It was hardly a conquering hero's welcome, this carefully orchestrated affair, but given the events of the past 3 days, it was all Yasser Arafat could expect, and he made the best and the most of it, telling the crowd precisely what they wanted to hear, that they are the vanguard of a revolution. But these pioneers of the Palestinian state, as Mr. Arafat called them, were but a few dozen strong. His esteem is not quite so high amongst the fundamentalists who claim support from half of Gaza's 1 million people. They blame Mr. Arafat for Friday's bloodbath.
We are considering Arafat personally is the main responsible and his authority.
But it's not just the fundamentalists who are questioning Mr. Arafat's leadership. Some moderates, once close to him, say the current problems in Gaza stem from a flawed agreement he signed with the Israelis.
He should have insisted on a better deal. This deal is not convincing to a majority of our public. It put Arafat in a humiliating position vis-à-vis Rabin and Israel. It removed any leverage in the hand of Chairman Arafat in the remaining parts of the negotiations.
His credibility